Our guest today is Major Andrew Fox, a former British Army officer known for his sharp insights on Hamas, Gaza warfare tactics, and Western security strategy. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Andrew, before we get into Gaza, the UN, and other topics, who are you? What shaped you? What experiences in Afghanistan and your work in disinformation made you into the analyst that you are today?
Well, I've been very lucky. I had a fantastic career in the army. As an officer, you often get stuffed with staff jobs, and I managed to swerve most of those. So I had an awful lot of command jobs, including 2 company commands in the Parachute Regiment. Before that, I was a Royal Welsh Fusilier. I did my tours in Afghanistan with the Mercian Regiment and the Scots, and then the US Army Green Berets. I did a tour in Afghanistan in 2009-10 with them. So I was an honorary Green Beret, which was an incredible experience. Then I essentially invested in my own education. I did a law degree before the army, and then whilst I was serving, I did a master's in war studies. And as soon as I left the army, I did another master's in psychology. I was a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, teaching war studies and behavioural science to officer cadets in training. But my war studies master's focused on the Middle East. And then a war obviously started on 7th of October 2023. My master's in psychology looked at disinformation and how the brain gets lied to, why we fall for these tricks. And so we had a war in the Middle East with loads of disinformation, which kind of layered onto my professional and academic expertise, tie that in with my military background, and did the very varied operational jobs I did. I think it gives me a relatively unique insight. The other major factor for me was fighting anti-Semitism. I've got very good Jewish friends. October the 7th was clearly a huge thing for Israel, but it was also a huge thing for other countries in the West. And my world changed when I saw people in London on the streets celebrating the massacre of Jews. I saw the effect it had on my friends, and I made a really concerted effort to stand up for the British Jewish community. They're very small, but we don't have many of them. And I know from talking to my friends that they feel under siege and lacking in allies. And so I was very keen to be an ally. So where analysis of the conflict in the Middle East is my professional expertise, my mission, personally, the one that means the most to me, was standing with British Jews. And that position got me an invitation to Israel. The IDF were very forward-leaning. They took me into Gaza. I've been in twice with the IDF. I was also the first international observer to go and watch a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution. I filmed that, and that footage went worldwide, which was really cool. And then I've been into Hezbollah tunnels in Lebanon with the Yahalom tunnel commandos. I've also spent time right on the front lines in Ukraine, down towards the Pokrovsk area where the fighting is. So my job is effectively going to war zones, looking at them, and then applying all that experience and academic knowledge I have to try and divine what I think is the truth. And I think that's the other mission that I've tried to do alongside fighting anti-Semitism, is just try and present a fair and balanced view of everything that's happened around Israel since 7th of October. So that's what I've tried to do.
Beautiful. So take me back to your first deployment. What did Afghanistan teach you about warfare, about human nature, about the cost that civilians play into this?
Well, I had a unique experience. So I was on the platoon commander's battle course, which is your sort of secondary training when you leave Sandhurst as an infantry officer. It's 6 or 7 months in Brecon in South Wales, where you get thrashed up and down the mountains and you learn your trade as an infantryman. The final part of that is planning live fire training, so how to do that safely. And we were in the middle of that when the officer commanding called 5 of us into his office and said, "You are all going to Afghanistan," which was, mind-blowing, because I'd just finished my training, and then 2 weeks later, I was in the desert. And I joined the Mercian Regiment just as they were doing a battle group assault into what was called the Green Zone, which is the areas just around the Helmand River. So it's desert, and then you have a strip of green, which they, because they can irrigate it from the river. And that's where all the fighting took place. So, 2 weeks out of training, I was there commanding a platoon. We had artillery firing, we had mortars, we had fast jets in the air, we had the machine gun platoon, we had tanks in support of us, over the canal on an infantry assault bridge, straight into the assault on the other side. So, I was headfirst into my trade professionally, straight out of training, which was an incredible experience. And when I was teaching the officer cadets at Sandhurst, they were really jealous of that, because there's no combat that the British Army do at the moment. And they asked me what it was like going to Afghanistan straight out of training. I was lecturing a hall of 120 officer cadets, and I said to them, it was amazing for me. I learned my trade. I learned a lot about myself, that actually the training works, and I knew what to do when someone was shooting at me, and I didn't freeze. I did my job well, and I was, I lived up to the standard that I set myself, which was a great personal experience. But I said to this room of officer cadets, like, look around, 10 of you are going to be dead, because that's what happened to my intake at Sandhurst. I've been to 11 funerals of friends and colleagues. And that is a real learning experience. In that assault, we had the youngest soldier in Afghanistan die. We lost our colour sergeant and his driver on that operation. And it was incredibly sobering to get that news over the radio net that, your colleagues have not made it. And then when it comes to civilians, there was a learning experience there where you were being fired at from a compound. An airstrike was called in, the compound was destroyed. And unfortunately, there were civilians in there. So we were going through the rubble afterwards. There were body parts, obviously, of children. There was clearly a female dead body, which was brutal, because the last thing you want to do as a soldier is cause harm to civilians. We were there to try and liberate Afghanistan from the Taliban. The people were our focus. We were there for them, and to have them killed by accident is utterly heartbreaking. And I've spoken to IDF soldiers since the war in Gaza started, and they feel exactly the same way. They're not there to kill Gazan civilians. They're there to rid the world of Hamas. And it's been really interesting working with the IDF, because there is a shared bond, I think, between soldiers. You have a language that you all speak, even if they speak Hebrew and I speak English. You have a bond, and particularly with the Israeli paratroopers, there's a real airborne bond as well. When you're a soldier who falls from the sky, that is a particularly unique experience. And when you meet other people who've shared that experience, there's a bond as well. So when it comes to human nature, warfare takes you to the edge of the extreme of where you can be as a human. It's life or death. And there is something particularly unique about when a bullet is coming near you, because you learn the difference between the sounds as well. You can tell whether the bullet's going over your head, or you can tell when it was really close. It makes a really different sound. And that takes you to a place that is intense, and very few people in the world go through that. And that's where I think that bond from fighting soldiers comes from. And the highs that you get when you get through one of those fights, and you win, and you have a reorganization at the end, and everyone's okay. Like, that is a high that, quite frankly, I don't think I'll ever get again. So yeah, it's a real learning curve about human nature when you go to war, because you see the extremes that you never would otherwise.
Where were you when you first saw the images from October 7th, and what did it do to you internally?
So as a Middle East researcher, I'm on Telegram, and I was on a lot of groups. So, almost as soon as the assaults started, I was seeing the videos that Hamas were putting up. And I was actually in Germany. I was in Frankfurt to go and watch my beloved Indianapolis Colts. Huge Colts fan. My family's from Indiana on one side, so I've got very strong links to the Midwest. But to get those videos first thing in the morning, it was just mind-blowing. The brutality, the savagery of what they did on 7th of October was just next level. And I don't think there's ever been a terrorist attack like it. And I think that's not very well understood in the world, just how terrible 7th of October really was. And, since then, I've been to Israel. I've been shown the 47-minute video, and I've seen more than that as well. If you go to Glilot, which is just outside Tel Aviv, I believe, obviously you're in the back of a van, so you don't know exactly where you are on the map, but Glilot is an intelligence base. And they took a high-level military trip there. It was retired generals and retired, Air Force officers of a very senior rank from all kinds of NATO countries: Italy, France, United States, Canada, and the UK. I was lucky enough to be the reporter for that. So I was there to take notes and write a report at the end. And they showed us the evidence of the sexual assaults and the rapes that happened on 7th of October. And, it still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up even thinking about it. And it was a very unique thing. It was a room full of very senior retired soldiers who'd been there. They'd seen everything, or thought they'd seen everything, until they saw that. These guys, we were all just ashen-faced, almost tearful at seeing it. Like, the horrors of 7th of October defy description, and the world really, I don't think, understands just how brutal it was.
So from a military perspective, what did Hamas think would happen? Did they miscalculate Israel's response, or did they predict that this would be their response?
I think there's two elements to this. If you look at the documents found in Sinwar's office when that was raided and taken, the plan, I think, was to try and generate a regional uprising. I think they genuinely thought the West Bank would rise up. They thought that Lebanon would rise up and would overwhelm Israel. I think that's what they intended. And they certainly wanted to get as far into Israel as they could and kill everyone they could find. And I know there's a famous junction just to the north of Gaza, inside Israel, where they were able to stop Hamas on that road. And if they'd broken through that junction, they were straight on the road to Tel Aviv, which was one of the kind of real victories for Israel on that day. There weren't many, it was a disaster, but that was one of the real victories. And that was just a few police officers and a special forces unit, I believe. The second part of this is Israel's response. And I think they thought they could do what they've always done, and that is use international pressure to get Israel to stop. That's where their human shield strategy comes from. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go to the Henry Jackson Society website and find my report that I wrote with Salo Eisenberg. It's called Hamas's Human Shield Strategy. It's a very long document, 264 footnotes. It's as evidenced as you can get of this deliberate human shield strategy. And I think because Israel didn't stop, they've been able to leverage that for PR gains. If they've made dead civilians on purpose in order to get that PR gain, they wanted to try and get Israel to stop with the hostages, with this human shield strategy. It didn't work. So they pivoted to this campaign to demonize Israel on the world stage. And I would say it has been phenomenally successful. If we look at strategic end states, we talk about win and loss in war, and I don't think it's that simple when it comes to a war like Gaza, because it's very hard to articulate what win actually looks like. If we frame it instead of strategic goals, you can measure your success against what you wanted to achieve when you started. And Hamas wanted this demonization of Israel. And I think they will consider the Gaza war a strategic success as it stands. Obviously, that might change with events in the future, but Hamas have had this incredible success in demonizing Israel and almost making it a pariah state, which is a deeply concerning thing. But that's what I think Hamas's strategy was and what they wanted to achieve. But we have to define defeat. I think that's the first thing we have to do. Now, in the military, we have what we call effects verbs. And when you're giving your orders, they're framed in effects verbs so that your subordinates know exactly what you want to achieve. So when I say destroy, there is a definition of destroy, so they know what that looks like. Defeat has a slightly different definition. It's actually reducing your enemy in combat effectiveness to between sort of 45 and 60%, roughly. So in terms of military defeated, Hamas their strategic capabilities are gone. Their ability to make weapons has been degraded. Their rocket stores have been degraded. Their fighting capability of trained soldiers has been almost completely destroyed. They've still got a large number of fighters, but these are new troops that aren't trained, that are basically goons with guns. They're not the very, very highly trained, Al-Qassam brigades that existed before the war. So in terms of defeating Hamas, they are defeated. They cannot anymore attack Israel, which I consider to be a huge win for the IDF. I think that's a tick in the box for what they wanted to achieve. Can Hamas be completely destroyed, wiped off the face of the earth? I would suggest not, simply because they're kind of like a hydra. The more you kill, the more of these goons with guns pop up and get recruited by Hamas. And then we have to look at kind of civil society as well. Hamas was infested in every element of Gaza that you can conceive of, the entire civil service, the judiciary, the police. Hamas were the government of Gaza. And the other thing with Hamas is they are, of course, a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot, which means that their ideology and their philosophy sits way outside Gaza as well. There's a significant Hamas presence in the West Bank. There's a significant presence in Lebanon and in Syria. They have significant international backing from Qatar and Turkey. So to completely eradicate that ideology, I think, is not going to be done by firepower. And I think when it comes to use of military force, there's a fantastic book called The Utility of Force by Rupert Smith, a retired British general, and he articulates what you can achieve with military force. And I think we have to be very precise when we're thinking about military operations of what do you actually want that force to achieve, and also understand what it can and cannot achieve, which is why I'm very skeptical of where we are now, because there's this big reconstruction plan. I don't think we have a military force yet that is capable of delivering it. They're talking about, Indonesian soldiers and that kind of thing. But look, the IDF haven't destroyed Hamas or removed Hamas in 2 years of intense combat fighting. The odds of a force of Indonesians with less capability than the IDF, with less intelligence, with less, freedom of maneuver, because they're going to have very strict rules of engagement and where they can and can't deploy. To have that force in there, the odds that they can remove Hamas when the IDF couldn't, I think is very challenging. So we're in a very kind of flux situation right now. The ceasefire is a non-existent thing. Hamas is still shooting at the IDF. The IDF is still responding. And we saw that just in the last 24 hours with 5 Israeli soldiers injured and then significant airstrikes near Al-Mawasi in response. So it's a very, very tense situation. I still don't think the end state is entirely clear. I've written a long Substack article, actually, if you don't mind me plugging my Substack. It's mrandrewfox.substack.com. I've written a long article, 3-part article on there about all the different military challenges that come from trying to plan this from the planning perspective. So yeah, we're in a state of flux, and the end state just isn't clear right now, so we don't know.
What do people get wrong about tunnels, booby traps, and the choice that the IDF has to level entire neighborhoods? Maybe speak about how many miles of tunnels there are under Gaza.
Yeah, well, it's a longer tunnel system than the London Underground. It's longer than the Paris Metro. It's longer than the New York subway. There's also revelations recently that it might be even longer than the 500 kilometers we were thinking of. It might even be closer to 1,000 meters of tunnels, which is astonishing. I think the IDF, and look, I went into Gaza for the first time in July 2024. I went to Rafah. And even I, as an experienced soldier who knew what I was going to see, I was gobsmacked by the level of destruction there. No, I understand why it was destroyed. I understand that Hamas were putting IEDs in whole city blocks, whole streets were loaded with bombs. They couldn't be defused, so the IDF just sent in things like remote control, armored personnel carriers that were loaded with explosives that just blew up and just wiped out the whole, IED belt. But I don't think the IDF had many other options. It seems like a sensible thing to me, but the damage it did cause is astonishing. And now we're seeing more footage from there. We're seeing that destruction, and it's getting boomed around the world. And I think the IDF really have failed to explain properly why that's the case. And I think there's a huge lesson from this war that information is a really powerful weapon. And we talk about the 7-front war with Syria, Lebanon, West Bank, Gaza, Yemen, Iraq, Iran. But I think what people miss is the 8th front. And the information war is as much a strategic threat to Israel as anything Hamas have got in their pockets. And that destruction just needs to be explained so much better, and it's not been done. And it's kind of fallen to people like me, other people who have large profiles. John Spencer's done it as well. He and I wildly disagree about certain things on this conflict, but, we both agree that, the damage is explainable, but it's not been explained. And that's really tricky. And you speak to the soldiers, and I've got a paper coming out next week. It's another Henry Jackson Society paper about lessons from Gaza. What can we learn about how the IDF operated there? And I think there's very important lessons that we can learn, both from the IDF's successes and their mistakes. And I think the information war is a huge lesson. When you're firing rounds of artillery or bullets, your information rounds need to be in the air at the same time, explaining that and trying to win that battle, because otherwise, you open the door for the enemy to use propaganda against you. An airstrike goes in. It may have been incredibly well planned. You've done your collateral damage assessment. You've used the right munition for the target that you're prosecuting. But the enemy can then take a video of that, say, hey, that's genocide. And that lie goes around the world faster than any truth you could put out. So it's really, really difficult, but it's something I think we have to do in the social media age. We've never had a war before that's been live streamed. You're seeing images of airstrikes seconds after the round landed. That's never happened before. Don't think that Western armies or even the IDF are set up to try and to combat that enemy propaganda that is always going to flow any time that we go to war in future.
You spent a lot of time dissecting the Gaza casualty lists. What is the single most important thing that the public misunderstands about those numbers?
And there's so much. But I think the number one thing is the fact that those numbers contain Hamas fighters. The IDF's estimate is 25,000 or thereabouts. And people often ask why Hamas is really accurate to the last number and the IDF isn't. And the answer is that, look, put yourself into the combat situation. Imagine that you're a soldier on the ground in Gaza going forward into an assault. Now, first of all, I can tell you, your mouth is dry, your heart is pounding, the adrenaline is flowing. You're lucky, you trust the guys to the right and your left. You've got a mission to do, you're going to do it. There's a level of determination in there. And then the bullets start flying. And, you're then in that intense state that I was talking about before, and you're focused on the mission, and it's carnage, there's bullets flying, there's explosions. What you're not doing is counting how many enemy are dropping. They're a good enemy. They're good fighters. They use cover. They hide in buildings. They hide in tunnels. And when rounds come in to destroy those, you don't then go in and count every single dead body, because, there's rubble, there's things you have to do. You've got a mission to carry out. You've got to secure the area. But what you do, and what the IDF do, is the same as us. You have a debrief afterwards where you ask your troops what they think, and you get a rough estimate, but you don't know for sure. And that's why the IDF are kind of giving large approximate numbers, is because that's just how war works. Now, Hamas let me start that again. The Afghanistan war, if you go on Wikipedia and look at how many civilian casualties there were, they give you, there's a potential error of 100,000. That's it could be 100,000, could be 200,000, we don't know. you look at any other war and you get rough estimates. This is a weapon Hamas is using. They're not counting the dead bodies because they think it's important to keep those records. They're counting dead bodies because they want to use that figure as a propaganda tool. Remember, everything they do is propaganda. The Hamas Ministry of Health is run by Hamas. There is no difference between the Al-Qassam brigades and the civil service in Gaza. They are Hamas, they are Muslim Brotherhood, they are fanatics, they are, Hamas have done purges over the years they've been in charge in Gaza to make sure that everyone is loyal to them. This is a weapon that they're using. And because civilians die in war, they always die in war. Look at Sudan, look at Nigeria, look at Ethiopia, look at Burkina Faso. The people who suffer most in war are civilians. This is not unusual. This is not new. This is not unique to Gaza. And my personal opinion is that the IDF have set a platinum standard for civilian protection. If you look at the amount of munitions dropped, they like to, the other side like to make a huge fuss about the amount, it's 2 Hiroshimas or 8 Hiroshimas, and yet that there are only 70,000 deaths. And I say that very reservedly, that's still a huge number. But for the amount of munitions dropped, it's incredibly low. It's less than, if you think it's 100,000 tons of munitions, for every ton of munitions dropped, they haven't even killed one person. There have been 360,000 soldiers that have been through Gaza wearing olive green of the IDF. And yet there are only 70,000 who've died, of which 25,000 are combatants. And that is astonishingly low. And it sounds so strange to say that, because 70,000 is a large number. But if the IDF had been careless, if they hadn't been targeting properly, if they had genuinely been targeting civilians, you could stick a 0 on the end of that. And the fact that it's so low I think is a really good indication of how careful the IDF have actually been when fighting in Gaza to protect civilians.
So how widespread is manipulation? Age lowering, the misclassified deaths, natural causes? Paint us the full picture of these numbers.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas have not announced a single natural death throughout the entire war. And if you look at the pre-war figures, about 5,000 people died of natural causes a year in Gaza. You also have to look at the civilians Hamas themselves have executed. You have to look at the fact they've tried to fire rockets, which a number of which drop short within Gaza and don't even reach Israel. You have to look at, the stuff we found was, we looked at ages being changed from 18 down to 17, which of course makes them into the children category. We found men listed as women. And it doesn't actually matter if this is just the challenge of recording stuff in a war zone that's carnage or whether it's deliberate manipulation. It actually doesn't matter. The key point is that these lists have not been reliable. And I published a paper last year, it was about December last year, where we looked at a variety of things. We looked at the casualty numbers and all the mistakes we could find. We looked at how reliable the IDF's estimates have been in the past of how many combatants they've killed. And actually, they've been very accurate. And when the dust has settled and the actual number has been announced, actually, the IDF count pretty well. We looked at the way the media use these numbers. 97% of world media uses Hamas's figures, and about 3% of world media uses the IDF's combatant deaths figures. It's a huge manipulation on the media side to only present one side in this conflict, and the side they've chosen to present is the psychotic terror group who slaughtered Jews on 7th of October, and they've ignored the democratic, Western-style army that have proven correct in the past. So that's astonishing in and of itself. Now, the greatest triumph of that paper I wrote was when Hamas themselves, just months after we published it, saying this is full of errors, deleted 3,000 to 5,000 names from those lists. It was a fantastic validation of that paper. I didn't expect my paper to be validated by Hamas, but actually, there's no one better to validate your work than the people you're criticizing. So the key point here is that the world's media should not have been relying on these figures. They are not correct. They certainly contained a number of errors. They contained huge numbers of combatants, but that was never reported. So there has been a, frankly, criminal reporting failure by the world's media when it comes to the death count in Gaza.
You said that the Gaza population has grown during the war. So how does that fact alone change the entire genocide narrative?
I mean, if you look at genuine genocides, huge numbers of people die. There have been well over 50,000 births as of February last year in Gaza during the war. Even Hamas themselves have said that. That's not, me making stuff up. This is Hamas admitting it themselves. And it was done in a context where it's like, hey, you may have killed a load of us, but we've just birthed another generation of people to fight you. They were claiming that as a win. The genocide thing, I'm in two minds about this, because on the one hand, it needs to be rebutted. But on the other hand, by taking it seriously, you almost validate it. Do you understand? It's like if you treat it this appalling blood libel seriously, then you actually give it credibility because you're engaging with it on an intellectual level, which is why on social media quite often I just resort to mockery. I find that a very powerful tool, actually, because a lot of people have made decisions about this war based on emotion rather than on logic or their own understanding or their experience. And when someone's made a decision on emotion, facts are not going to change their mind. And the analogy I always give is if you're in an argument with your partner, and you say to them, you're being irrational, calm down. These are the facts. That's only going to escalate it. Try telling your partner to calm down in the middle of a fight. It doesn't work. And that's the equivalent of what we're trying to do with these people who are emotionally activated. They've seen these awful images. And it is awful. War is horrifying. War is shockingly appalling. It's the worst thing humanity can do, killing other humans. And actually, legality is one thing. You can follow the law of armed conflict, but legality and morality are different things. You're still killing other human beings, and that is fundamentally a moral act. And it's totally understandable that people would be upset and wound up by seeing these images that are being pumped onto their phones 24/7, but they're devoid of context. They're devoid of the planning process that went into the airstrike. They're devoid of an understanding of the law of armed conflict. They're devoid of understanding what that target was and who was trying to be, who they were trying to kill. So when it comes to genocide, sometimes I think just mockery and not taking it seriously is the way forward, because it is a shocking blood libel. It's designed to invert the Holocaust. It's designed to weaponize the Holocaust against Jews and try and claim somehow that a legal war fought in a legal way is the equivalent to death camps that mechanically killed 6 million people. Just to compare the two like that, I find it an obscenity. So sometimes I think not taking it seriously and just laughing at these people is sometimes the best way of dealing with it.
We could define what the word genocide means, in international law, and also maybe speak a little bit about battlefield ratios and what normal numbers look in other wars.
So, the Genocide Convention is very clear. And where the Gaza case fails is on intent. And you can cherry pick stuff that Bibi said. You can cherry pick stuff that Yoav Gallant said. You can cherry pick stuff that President Herzog said. But then when you put those cherry picked lines back in the actual speech, you can see that a lot of the stuff that has been claimed as genocidal intent is just talking about Hamas. So there's a very cynical manipulation going on there. Nobody has ever said in a position of command that matters that wiping out everyone in Gaza is the goal of this. And actually, if wiping out everyone in Gaza was the objective, then the IDF are the worst shots on the planet. They are the most incompetent buffoon army in the world, if that's what they wanted to do, because they have failed to kill, anything like a genocide within Gaza. And they have the capability to do that. They could have smashed Gaza to pieces in 6 days, if that's what they really wanted to do. And yes, people talk about the rubble, and they say, look, you created conditions that, that are going to end people's lives. And that may be the case in some instances, but it's still a small number. And if you look at the lists, people aren't being reported as just dying from the fact that Gaza has been smashed up. It's just not being reported. Even the starvation allegation, only 400 people are reported as having died of malnutrition in 2 years. That is not starvation. It simply is not. Yes, there are pockets of places in Gaza where people are going hungry. The last UN report said there were 5,000 children with signs of malnutrition at various levels of malnutrition. 5,000 out of 2.3 million is a tiny number of people who are suffering from hunger. And also, if we look at the statistics of the aid that's gone in, 3,000 calories a day on average per person have gone into Gaza during this war. There's not only enough food in there to feed every single Gazan, there's enough food to make every single Gazan fat. And the fact that it's not reaching some small pockets of people is a failure of distribution, not a failure of supply. So we can take away the allegation of starvation against Israel as well. And when we look at ratios, I'm very wary of doing this. I'm very wary because it doesn't matter. Because you can have a 1-to-1 ratio of combatants and civilians. But if that one civilian was killed illegally, then that's still a war crime. You could have a ratio of 1 combatant to 20 civilians, and those 20 civilians could have been killed legally as legal collateral damage. And I think even framing it this way shows you how horrible war is, that you are framing the death of innocent people as legal and unacceptable. That is how brutal and horrible war is. But rather than ratios, I prefer to look at legality. How many of those civilians on that list, if we say 25 combatants out of 70,000 That leaves, 45,000 civilians. How many of them were killed legally? And it's a brutal way to look at it, and it feels dirty to say it, but that's just how war works. That's how the law of armed conflict works. There's something called proportionality. When you drop an airstrike or when you fire ammunition that kills people, you say, right, is the military gain from what I've just done, is the collateral damage, acceptable when I look at the military gain that I've just achieved? And I think the best example of this in Gaza is the killing of Mohammed Deif. He was taking shelter in a compound within Al-Mawasi, which was the humanitarian zone. So again, Hamas using that humanitarian zone to hide their most senior commander. And Israel dropped a ton of bombs on that guy. 2,000 pounders, tunnel busters, there was an enormous amount of munition. But you can say that was justified because Mohammed Deif was such an important military target. You could justify a huge number of collateral deaths to get him. If that had just been a goon with a gun, some 17-year-old kid who's been recruited as a child fighter, you could not justify the amount of munitions that we used to kill Mohammed Deif to kill that one individual fighter. And that's how proportionality works. So rather than ratios, I always recommend people look at proportionality and the legality of what's occurring when bombs are flying and bullets are flying.
You were one of the first foreign journalists that were allowed into Gaza. What did you see that we don't see on the nightly news? Was there anything that surprised you? Speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I would say I've never claimed to be a journalist. I'm a conflict analyst and I'm an academic researcher. So, journalists have a slightly different job to me. My job is to take an academic perspective and try and bring academic levels of proof into what I write and what I see and say. I think the most important thing that I saw that most people can't see is the fact I've spent time with soldiers who served in Gaza. 401 Brigade were the unit that we went to visit down at a Swedish village, which is the furthest west you can go on the Philadelphia corridor, which is the southernmost sort of road between Egypt and Gaza. And you go to Swedish village and the beach is genuinely lovely. And you look and you can see what Gaza could have been if Hamas had dedicated themselves to making a sensible, happy society rather than a terror state full of tunnels. So that tragedy really, when I saw the beach, that really kind of hit home. As you saw what, if you just built hotels, you could have made it an incredible Mediterranean seaside destination. But talking to the soldiers was really the eye-opener for me. Straight away you recognize certain bits of body language and the looks on their faces. And it reminded me of when we were towards the end of a 6-month war in Afghanistan, where you are tired. You're incredibly skinny because the calories you're burning don't match the calories you're putting into your body. That's the only time in my life I had a 6-pack was at the end of an Afghan tour, and it didn't last very long. You could see their faces, the strain. You could see the challenge of combat and that, and also, I saw the IDF soldiers in a sort of building they'd occupied, and the junior soldiers were goofing around, and it was exactly what my boys used to do. When we had downtime. Just playing stupid tricks on each other and pranking each other and just laughing and joking over a cup of tea or coffee. And you could just see the strain on these guys and how challenging that combat in Gaza really has been. I don't think if you were just going in there and shooting up and blowing up everything you just could see, you wouldn't have that strain. This was a war against a very clever, very well dug in, very experienced enemy who could use tunnels. Hamas were even digging tunnels during the war. There are instances of them using the main tunnel and digging a branch up to get to the IDF position and pop out and have an ambush. The IDF soldiers were stringing tin cans on strings around their defensive positions so that when Hamas were crawling in to try and attack them, they'd set off the tin can and give them a warning. That is an incredibly challenging combat operation. I cannot think of a harder, more challenging environment to operate in as a soldier than Gaza. It's a 360-degree threat that goes not only around you, but above you and buildings below you in tunnels. This is an incredibly straining experience. And you could really see that in the soldiers. And I recognized that, and it kind of really brought home to me just how challenging fighting in Gaza has been for these guys.
Why is no one talking about Egypt? Rafah's border was sealed and it's not part of the international outrage. Is it fair to say that Egypt, not Israel, was the one that prevented mass civilian evacuation?
Yeah, 100%. Now, I've seen suggestions that Israel should have let Gaza's civilians into the Negev, maybe in refugee camps. How can you possibly sell that to the Israeli public in the aftermath of that massacre? They've just invaded you 6,000 people have just flooded into Israel from Gaza and slaughtered and raped and mutilated your people. The idea that you could then take those people into Israel as a protection is just a nonsense. It's just not going to happen, which means the only place they could have gone is Egypt. And what did Egypt do? They reinforced the border. When you drive the Philadelphia corridor, you can see that wall that they've built. Nobody's getting through there. And Egypt sealed that border and prevented the civilians from evacuating. It's the only war zone in the world where civilians can't flee. Look at Sudan, huge refugee camps in Ethiopia. Look at Ukraine. Millions of Ukrainians left the country to go and live elsewhere in Europe as refugees whilst the war was going on. This is normal. When a war is happening, civilians flee. They were prevented from doing that. And Egypt, in my opinion, has a monstrous amount of blood on their hands. And then they had the gall to join the genocide case in the ICJ against Israel. If that was a genocide, Israel had the ability to end it just by opening a gate, and yet they didn't. So Egypt, for my money, is a real criminal in this conflict, and they're not getting enough flack over that, quite frankly.
What does that tell us about the Arab state politics towards Palestinians? What do the Arab states actually think about Palestinians?
Well, it's very interesting. I think in the Arab world, there is a pecking order with the Saudis at the top because they have Mecca and Medina. And at the bottom of that is Palestinians. And when you look at the Palestinians themselves, the tribal structure they have, those in Judea and Samaria look down on Gaza as the very, very bottom. So the Palestinians are the bottom of the Arab world. And I think if we take a moment and step back, I think the Arab world has used the Palestinian situation as a stick to beat Israel. There is certainly in certain countries a very strong idea of waqf. I don't know if you're familiar with the Islamic term. What that means is a piece of land that had once been Muslim. It should always be Muslim. It should never be possessed by anyone else. And so they consider the existence of Israel an insult to the religion of Islam. And that is a very strong sort of Muslim Brotherhood opinion. And what they've got now with Palestine is an opportunity to smash Israel on the international stage. And so the Palestinians, I think, have been, in the Arab world, dehumanized. They've been treated as a tool rather than, a bunch of people with families and lives. That's not been really a consideration. And they've just been used as this political weapon to beat Israel with.
In a city like Gaza, where you have fighters that hide without uniforms and weapons, are pre-positioned, how realistic is it to have perfect accuracy when you're the IDF targeting these Hamas terrorists?
So I think we have to understand how targeting works. And let me talk you through the process. First of all, it's intelligence driven. And intelligence in Gaza has been a bit of a revolution. The IDF before the war were very reliant on technology for their intelligence. Since the war started, I spoke to one Major General Goldfuss. He was commander of, I think it was 96th Division, who fought in every part of Gaza. He was saying that this war has been a revolution in human intelligence. So informants and spies finding Hamas locations. But once you've identified a location that you think might be a target, you then do what we call soaking it. And that basically means putting a drone up, eyes in the sky, maybe even an intelligence team on the ground to sort of do the sneaky stuff and go in and look at the target. And then you start making your assessment. You start looking at who you want to hit and how you want to hit them. And you'll do an assessment like, does this need a ground assault? Does it need an airstrike? Can we do it with a small drone? You start working out what that target looks like. You then look at the potential collateral damage. And that's one of the things you do when you're soaking the target with intelligence. You're looking at the pattern of life. You're looking at, how many people might be in that building, how many of them are, are Hamas, how many of them are civilians. And then you make an assessment. And it's that proportionality assessment. You're like, can I now strike this target? Is it valuable enough that I can justifiably kill X number of civilians? And you look at then the munition that you want to use. Do you want to use a big 2,000 pound? Do you want to use one of the little sort of 250 pound? Do you want to use a helicopter main armament or a tank main armament? You make that assessment. And then you go through the sort of lawyers to make sure it's legally, above board. And only then do you push the button to prosecute that target. So that's how targeting works. And what the IDF also have done is used artificial intelligence. And there was a terrible article in 972 magazine that hammered them for this. They got loads of stuff wrong in that article. But actually, the use of AI, I think, has shortened that targeting cycle. There's still a human in the loop. And that's really important. It's the human that makes the decision on this. And they still follow that process once the AI has given them the target. But that has really shortened the target time. And they're reporting that 90% of targets in Gaza were being prosecuted in real time. which is actually an incredible achievement, because to do that 90% in real time and still follow that process, which they do, is an incredible achievement. And that's a huge lesson for Western armies, because we're now looking at AI, we're now looking at automation, we're looking at, how we fight based on the Ukrainian experience. And we should be looking at the Gaza experience as well, because there's some really important targeting lessons to learn from that. And the final thing I would say, and I'm sorry, this is a long answer, the IDF has something called the Civilian Harm Mitigation Cell, which is a small intelligence cell, a small team, but it's open source intelligence, it's signals intelligence, it's Arabic speakers. And there's a map of Gaza where they've broken it down into a load of different cells, and they get a live update on their intelligence as to how many civilians are in that cell. And that factors into the targeting process as well. Everyone in the IDF can access that map and see how many civilians are. And again, I'll say it once more, the IDF have set the platinum standard for civilian protection for militaries going forward.
Let's speak a little bit about the United Nations and how they've been biased against Israel with UNRWA, the casualty numbers, emergency sessions. Is the UN structurally capable of impartiality on Israel, or is this something that will never happen?
I mean, just look at the number of states that are members that are, from dictatorships that have very strong Muslim roots, who may well believe in some of the more extreme interpretations of the Middle East. The whole thing is loaded against Israel. And also it's slightly farcical when you have countries like Iran on the Human Rights Commission, when you have judges from Lebanon judging Israel when they've previously said that Israel is an enemy state. This is not a fair and transparent system. And I think what the UN has done over the last 2 and a bit years is utterly degrade itself to the point where it's now a malign actor in the Middle East. They are actively making things worse. When you have UN officials saying that 14,000 children are going to die in 24 hours, when you have Guterres inventing 500 trucks of aid a day going into Gaza. He was the origin of that 500 trucks a day thing. When you actually look at the figures, before the war, the number of trucks that were going into Gaza containing food was between 70 and 80. Guterres said 500, pulled the number out of nowhere, and then for the whole war, that 500 trucks thing was used to beat Israel. This is the UN making up disinformation to beat Israel with. And as an institution, I think it's useless, degraded, and doing more harm than good at this point.
You mentioned how the media accepts Hamas's supplied numbers. It seems that the UN is also accepting their numbers without independent verification. Can you speak a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, it's quite funny when they publish the numbers through UN Archer. They have an asterisk. And then you go to the bottom of the sheet, and in like 4-point letters, it's like, we haven't independently verified these. So it's the tiniest little caveat you can imagine. It's a strange one because, they feel the need to do this job. The only source they have is Hamas. And so they're repeating Hamas's numbers because there's nothing else out there that they can use. But if we look at the media particularly, the way the media has been manipulated is actually very, very clever. And Abu Ubaidah, who is now dead, I think objectively was a genius, an evil genius, but a genius. Like the way that guy set up the propaganda system in Gaza is truly remarkable. And let me talk you through it. So when a Hamas team go out on the ground to do an ambush or attack the IDF, they always had a cameraman with them, a journalist that would be live streamed back to their headquarters. So even if everyone on that team died, including the journalist, they would still have the footage. And they have an incredibly talented team in those cells to create those propaganda videos. But you have these journalists who are Hamas stringers, who are pumping Hamas's lines to take to even Western journalists, but particularly Al Jazeera. That is the kind of the nexus of where this comes from, because they've built up a reputation over years in the English language version anyway, of being a very reliable, mainstream media outlet. So when Al Jazeera publish a story, other news outlets are quite happy to pick that up and republish it without checking it because they trust Al Jazeera as a source. And so Al Jazeera has been able to pump out Hamas propaganda non-stop, 24 hours a day for 2 years. That's been picked up and reported around the world. And this whole ecosystem of lies then develops about the IDF. A great example is the Al-Ahli hospital bombing, where a hospital was never bombed. It was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell short into the car park. And yet Hamas were claiming 500 dead within seconds of that bomb landing. The BBC were reporting that Israel had airstrikes on a hospital. That led to immediate protests outside the Israeli embassy in London. And it was all nonsense. Nowhere near 500 people died. A hospital wasn't bombed. And yet the world's media farmed this story out. It went round the world. And then when the correction came later, it was far too late. because as far as people are concerned, Israel bombed a hospital. And if you look at Google, Al-Ahli Hospital, it's still the story about Israel being the bad guy. That is now the permanent narrative when you Google that incident. And it's a great example of how that media ecosystem has pumped Hamas lies around the world constantly for 2 years.
Much of Hamas's ideology traces back to the Muslim Brotherhood, like we brought up before. What does the world misunderstand about the Muslim Brotherhood's influence? And what do you think about the United States' steps towards going against the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States? And what took it so long?
I mean, it's a baby step. It's a baby step in the United States. They haven't named the key operators for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Turkey and Qatar, because actually the US have just bribed Turkey and Qatar to get the hostages released. You know, if there's a winner from this war, I think it's probably Qatar. They've played a blinder and they've established themselves as a major player on the world scene. And they are just a tiny little state of Muslim Brotherhood fanatics. The Muslim Brotherhood are very clever in how they operate, very clever indeed. And it's a bottom-up approach. It treats, they treat Islam as a political philosophy rather than a religion. And they see it as a political system that needs to be imposed. And when you look at Hamas in Gaza, when they sort of set up in the 90s, the way they did it was through mosques. The number of mosques in Gaza multiplied by a huge factor once the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, were operating in there. And they use those mosques to radicalize people from the ground up. And then they take over the political system. And we're seeing traces of that now in the West. I mean, if you look at the fact that the UK has 5 Gaza MPs, members of parliament, and one of them was behind the disinformation campaign, the lies to get Maccabi Tel Aviv fans banned from the Aston Villa match. This is how the Muslim Brotherhood operates. It's a ground up. They use, front organizations, fake charities, fake youth outfits to radicalize people and then generate that groundswell at the lowest level that can then politically start having an effect. And that's why they're so dangerous. And that's also why they're so hard to ban, because you can ban the Muslim Brotherhood, but when they're a sort of spider web-like network of fake charities and fake businesses, that's really hard to track down. They get their main direction from Qatar and Turkey, and it's not a problem that's going to go away until we take that head on. And I think those two countries have played a blinder as well, because they've made it very difficult to take them head on. So the Muslim Brotherhood is a real problem. Banning them is the first step. But then tracking down that network and trying to shut that down is the next step. And that's going to be incredibly difficult for any country that tries it.
What is the most realistic governance model for a post-Hamas Gaza? What's the single biggest obstacle to, long-term peace? Just give us your view of the future.
I mean, that's an incredibly difficult question, by far the hardest one you've asked me. The honest answer is I don't know, but I can also speculate slightly. And I think the biggest obstacle is Hamas. Getting rid of them is going to be nearly impossible as it stands. They still have half of Gaza. They've got almost all the population. They've still got 2 million people in their half of Gaza. And they have ruthlessly and violently consolidated their control in that area. And it goes back to my point earlier that they are infested in every element of life within Gaza. And getting rid of that is going to be incredibly challenging, because if we look at counterinsurgency campaigns, you'll need 40 to 50,000 soldiers in Gaza to try and control that and eventually try and win the population over, which is the core of Western counterinsurgency doctrine. And it'll take years. And we tried it in Afghanistan for 20 years and it didn't work. Getting rid of these enemy forces is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And what I don't think we have at the moment is a military force capable of doing that. So they're the biggest obstacle. Look, I've said it for nearly 2 years now. I don't think you're going to get rid of Hamas. I think the most likely option is a kind of enhanced wall around the place, and just let them get on with it, and then Lebanonize it, if you will, where if you see any threats, it gets smacked immediately. I don't see a long-term recipe for peace in the Middle East right now, and it's some incredibly depressing thing to say. But Turkey are going to consolidate in Syria. Qatar and Turkey are going to try and have their fingers in Gaza to support their Muslim Brotherhood friends in Hamas. If we look at what's happening in Judea Samaria and the West Bank right now, the IDF are having to they're having to conduct counter-terror operations because of that uplift of threats from there. They're striking places in Syria because there's terrorist threats there as well. They're hitting Lebanon just today because Hezbollah are trying to rearm. It's a very, very flux situation. There's so many variables here that I'm not going to risk my professional reputation by trying to predict the future, because there's just so many different ways this could go.
I want to thank you for your time and for your insights. Where can people find you, learn more about you? Anything you want to plug? You're more than welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, my main social media is Substack. It's Mr. Andrew Mr. MrAndrewFox.substack.com, where you'll get regular sort of deep dives into conflict, a weekly conflict roundup, and then sort of opinion pieces on what's happening in the Middle East. Or you can find me on X, which is at Mr._Andrew_Fox. And my own personal website is www.andrewfox.online.